Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you're all here. And it's a great honor and a privilege for us to have Alan Dershowitz here with us today. Okay. First, I'd like to thank my wife, Judy, for all she did to set this event up and make it happen. Thank you so much, Judy. She's amazing. And thank you to Marilyn, Shelley, Stephanie, Lydia, and Marcia for checking everybody in today. Thank you so very much. Professor Dershowitz, we are so grateful for your life's work of standing up for justice and fair treatment under the law for all Americans. We are grateful for your monumental service to our country, and we at the Jewish Republican Alliance want you to know you will always have a friend in us. We are here today to listen to what you have to say with an open mind, to engage in a dialogue with you, and let you know that even though you have been demonized by the left, the Jewish Republican Alliance stands with you. Our members come from a very diverse background. Like America and Israel, we have members from all faiths and places. Our mission is to unite and energize conservatives to take action on behalf of America and Israel. And we as Jews, as Christians, as conservatives, can truly identify with what Professor Dershowitz has been going through. For years, we too have been the target of vicious and baseless attacks that have been used by the left to demonize us. But we are here to thank you for all you have done to strongly speak out, to defend the Constitution of the United States and the civil rights for all Americans. We thank you for your bravery and your courage that you have always shown by being a staunch defender of Israel and the Jewish people. And we thank you for your 3 amazing PragerU videos that you made on Israel's founding, Israeli settlements, and the BDS movement. Everybody should watch those videos. Even if you've already seen it, you should watch them again and download the transcripts. They're really amazing. But most recently, we want to thank you for your historic presentation on Capitol Hill at the impeachment trial. This presentation, I'm sure, will be studied for generations and scholars for years to come. But in Alan Dershowitz's concluding historical remarks, he said, "I love the country that welcomed my grandparents, made them into great patriots and supporters of the freest and most wonderful country in the history of the world. I love our Constitution, the greatest and most enduring document in the history of mankind. I respectfully urge you to not let your feelings about one man, strong as they may be, to establish a precedent that would undo the work of our founders, injure the constitutional future of our children, and cause irreparable damage to the delicate balance of our system of separation and of powers and checks and balances." Those were amazing words. And so, in conclusion, we as Americans owe Alan Dershowitz a big thank you for helping our president achieve another big legal victory and for defending our Constitution when others did not have the courage to do so. Nancy Pelosi said that President Trump is forever impeached. But thanks in large part to Alan Dershowitz, President Trump can say forever acquitted. And now I'd like to introduce fellow co-founder Mitch Silberman. Mitch.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, many of you know that it says in the Bible, those that bless Israel will be blessed. and those that curse Israel will be. Last week at Rabbi Brisky's Lunch and Learn, he gave ample examples of that throughout history. And Stephanie and I had our own example of it last week. Some of you may know we spent a week in Azerbaijan. Now, I know what you're thinking. What's the big deal? Everyone goes there all the time, right? Most people don't know where it is or how to spell it. But we spent a week there, and it was miraculous. And I'll share with you as it relates to, as Bruce said, one of the staunchest defenders of Israel is right here in our room, so it's very apropos. This is a country that's 98% Muslim. They don't tolerate Jews. They embrace Jews. The country actually built and paid for a synagogue for them. And it has an amazing history. So about 300 years ago, Jews were being persecuted and running away from whatever troubles they caused in the world, of course. And whoever the ruler or the prince of Azerbaijan was at the time said, you are welcome here. So for hundreds of years, Azerbaijan has been incredibly friendly to Jews in Israel. And as we went around the country, we saw one homeless person. We saw no dirt on the streets, no graffiti, a modern city. And I saw right there is living proof that they have been blessing Jews in Israel for hundreds of years, and they themselves are blessed. In fact, Stephanie and I met with the first ever female Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who's Muslim, of course, and that's when it dawned on me how incredible their country is doing. And here yet is another example of bless the Jews and you will be blessed. And so it's interesting because the country has a long history, but it only gained its independence. Anyone know what it used to be part of? Right, Soviet Union. So it's an old country, yet it gained its independence when the Soviet Union fell. So, and they're also a new country. The president of the country, Aliyev, his wife is the vice president. I know. And his father is the founding president after the Soviet Union fell. So he has an iron grip on this country. So one of the rabbis told us, we actually had Shabbat dinner at the Chabad of Baku rabbi's home. Can you believe it? I'm convinced that Chabad is going to get to Mars before we do. Anyway, so he told us that the president of the country brought all the rabbis to the presidential palace, and it is a palace. We saw it. It's monstrous. And he told them in no uncertain terms, we will not tolerate anti-Semitism here. They walk around the Chabad rabbis like they always do, and they are incredibly blessed. They are incredibly free, and it was really an amazing thing. And we visited the oldest shtetl in Europe. This synagogue had been there for about 300 years, and they all speak Azerbaijani, of course, but they also speak Russian. So the rabbi was speaking, giving us a history, and the interpreter was saying something, and then the rabbi said something in Russian followed by the word Trump, and I said, whoa, 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 what did he just say? And he put his hand on his heart, and he said, Trump is our friend. And it was so nice. And then I was sharing with this rabbi of Baku, or Chabad of Baku, I said, you know, I had a discussion with a rabbi here in Conejo Valley, and I told him, I'm starting to think that President Trump's election was divine intervention. And the rabbi here said, of course, which was his polite way of saying, duh. When I relayed that story to the Chabad rabbi of Baku, his answer was, well, that's obvious. And then the last thing I'll share with you is he said something so profound. I asked him to repeat it to me, and Stephanie and I both heard it. He said, President Trump was elected so God could protect the Jews. Isn't that profound? So I thought, how apropos with Professor Dershowitz here to speak to us. So this is my one and only prop. Oh yeah, please silent your phones, please, if you haven't already. Thank you. So put your phones on stun. So this is a little prop, and if you've seen it before, that's okay. We're gonna have a little fun with it, and if you can't read it, this is the participation part, and you'll get it. So here's last time I was in Israel, the shirt here, it says, civilizations, nations, and empires have tried to destroy the Jewish state. So, nation, ancient Egypt, status, thank you, Carol Merrill. Status, gone. Philistine, gone. Assyrian Empire, gone. Babylonian Empire, gone. Persian Empire, gone. Greek Empire, gone. Roman Empire, gone. Byzantine Empire, Crusades, Spanish Empire, Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, Iran, big question mark. But the bottom line, the Jewish people, the smallest of nations, but with a friend in the highest of places, so be nice. Thank you. He is a graduate of Brooklyn College. I found out today he and my dad were born in the same year and grew up in Brooklyn. And he's a graduate of Brooklyn College and Yale Law School. Joined the Harvard Law School faculty at age 25. He is a vocal defender of civil liberties and the Constitution through the media appearances, his many media appearances. Alan Dershowitz is the author of 40 books, works of fiction and nonfiction, including 7 bestsellers. More than 1 million of his books have been sold worldwide in numerous languages, and more than 1 million people have heard him lecture around the world. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Alan Dershowitz. There you go, Professor. Thank you. Thank you. You want to hold it? You want to hold it?
Thank you. Thank you so much. What's a nice Jewish Democrat doing at a place like this? I like to say I'm not a Republican yet. Whenever I meet with President Trump, he asks me all the time, why? Why? And I look him in the eye and I say, there's one man who could make me become a Republican. And he says, me? I say, no, Bernie Sanders. I'm in the process of actually writing a book, which I think many of you will find interesting. At least you'll agree with the first half of it. The name of the book is Why I Left the Left But Couldn't Join the Right. And why I left the left is obvious. It's not so much I've left the left, they've driven me out. I can't obviously support a party that is run by people who are anti-American, anti-Israel, anti-free speech, anti-due process. But why am I not a Republican? One reason is because this isn't England. If this were England, I'd be a conservative. Very easy. Because the Conservative Party in England supports a woman's right to choose, it supports gay rights, it opposes the death penalty, it supports environmental concerns, it supports separation of church and state. In America, it's a very different situation. If you here in this room were the Republican Party, it would be easy for me. And I love evangelical Christians, particularly because of their support for Israel. When I spoke at Liberty University recently, the most polite people in the world at Liberty University, I talked about a woman's right to choose, and I got, little, because they're so polite, talk about gay rights. Then I talked about Israel, and I couldn't speak for 15 minutes. It was a standing ovation. But the Republican Party in the United States is, like the Democratic Party, very, very divided, and makes a lot of people like me feel kind of politically homeless. And we are seeking a home. The book I'm writing, the subtitle is Quest for a Vibrant Middle, Return to the Middle. America thrives when the debates are between conservatives and liberals. But today, we're seeing the debates more, and they're not debates, they're shouting matches and screaming matches and name-calling between extremists on the hard left, and some extremists, obviously, on the hard right as well. And there used to be things that united us. Today, not so much. So it's very, very, very hard to find things that unite us today. One thing that actually does unite us is baseball. I'm wearing my Brooklyn Dodger ring, so I have some association. We have in the audience here, I don't know where he is, if he'll stand up, the star shortstop for the Israel baseball team. Are you here? Here! Zach, he's going to bring a gold medal to Israel in Japan. He has been the clutch hitter for the team. Whenever they've been down 2 runs, man on second and third, he's the guy who brings them in. So we can unite around Jewish baseball. You know, I have yichus. I grew up down the block from Sandy Koufax. And I played basketball against him. Well, I wouldn't put it quite that way. He played basketball, and I kind of just stood there and watched in awe as he could dunk from the left side and the right side. His dad, Irving Koufax, was the local lawyer down the block, and he was quite an athlete. You know the story. In Brooklyn, they used to tell the story after Walter O'Malley made the terrible decision, from my point of view, not from your point of view, of bringing the Dodgers from Brooklyn to Los Angeles. The joke was, you're in a room, you have a gun, it has 2 bullets, and in the room is Stalin, Hitler, and O'Malley. What do? And the answer is you shoot O'Malley twice. We hated that when we were kids. But you know, I grew up in a very divided time. I grew up during McCarthyism. I went to Brooklyn College, and one of the professors that many of us liked was a professor named Slockower. He was a very good English professor, and he was fired because he took the Fifth Amendment when he was called in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee. He wouldn't name names and tell people who had been in the Communist Party in the 1930s. And I was the president of the student government, and I stood up for him. And I hated communism, but I stood up for his right and our right to learn from him if he was teaching English literature. And the man who was pushing hardest to get him fired was the chairman of the Foreign Languages Department of Brooklyn College, a man named Eugene Scalia, the father of Justice Scalia. And I first met Nino Scalia, who I became very close friends with over the years, though we disagreed about our judicial philosophies, through our common admiration for his father, though we were on different sides of the issues. So McCarthyism was a very divisive time in America. The Vietnam War, none of you are old enough to remember any of this. I'm just repeating history, but the Vietnam War was very divisive, in many ways even more divisive in some ways than now, because physical violence was being used. People from the Weathermen were planting bombs at the University of Wisconsin. They were planning to blow up Fort Dix. Terrible violence. I represented the Chicago 7 in their appeal from the case, and I represented Dr. Spock's appeal. So I was very involved in the Vietnam War. Again, a very divided time after 9/11, a very divided time. I represented one of the most popular defendants in the history of criminal law, O.J. Simpson. Pretty divided time. I got a lot of antagonism. I have never lived in a more divided time than right now. Never in my life. I don't think we as a country have been through a division like this since the end of the Civil War and the Reconstruction period. Certainly never in the 20th century. Never in the 20th century. Look, we lived during difficult times in the 20th century. I was mentioning, I went the other night, my wife and I went to the LA Philharmonic. And I was planning to have a wonderful, wonderful evening listening to, they had a program of Bertolt Brecht and Weill and other German emigres from the 1930s. And of course, nothing in LA can be non-political. And so the announcer gets up, we all want to hear music, and the announcer gets up and starts making an anti-Trump speech. And what he said was basically, it was subtle. What he said was, you know, in the 1930s, America opened its doors to immigrants and refugees, not like now. And I almost stood up and said, that is just a blatant lie. My relatives were killed in Europe because Franklin Delano Roosevelt turned back the St. Louis, closed the doors. We had a United States senator from Mississippi said, we're not going to let Jewish little children, babies in. Today they're cute little Jewish babies, but in 20 years they'll grow up to be ugly Jewish, and then he used the K word for Jews on the floor of the United States Senate. How dare anybody stand up in front of an audience? And they gave him a standing ovation. Of course, they cheered and loud because it was an anti-Trump statement at bottom. But it was a lie, and we see so many lies today that are being perpetuated. People today think the ends justify the means, and because they are so anti-Trump, many people, in a totally irrational way, look, every president deserves to be criticized. I've never not criticized the president who I've voted for. For me, bipartisanism means you criticize the president you voted for and you support the president you voted against when they do the right thing. And that's what I try my best to do. But there's so much antagonism and hatred today that it's impossible to really have dialogue. And I was victimized by it myself most recently, and I'm in the process of making a very, very hard decision in my own life. Some of you may remember that after I made my speech in front of the Senate, and that was successful, a lot of the senators came over to me and said I had influenced their decision. Ted Cruz and a few others said that I had been a deciding factor in senators voting against hearing witnesses, because my argument was basically there wasn't an impeachable offense alleged. And if you don't allege an impeachable offense, you don't hear witnesses. It's just not an impeachable offense. So then what happened is CNN and MSNBC and some of the Democratic leaders set out to try to hurt my credibility. And I was asked the following question the next day when I spoke at the question period. I was asked by Ted Cruz, through the Chief Justice, well, what about quid pro quo? What if there were a quid pro quo? Would that make it an impeachable offense? And I gave an interesting and relatively full 5-minute answer. I said I was just honored to come back from the White House. I had just come back from the White House, where the president laid out the new plan for Israel and the Palestinians, and the plan contains a quid pro quo. Basically says to the Palestinians, you want $50 billion, you got to come and sit down at the table. You don't sit down at the table, you don't get the $50 billion. Or then I pointed to Senator Sanders in the audience and I said, what if a Democrat were to be elected president and the Democrat were to say to Israel, unless you stop settlement building, you're not getting any money? That would be a quid pro quo. I wouldn't agree with it, but it wouldn't be impeachable. And I said the only way a quid pro quo would be impeachable is if it involved criminal conduct. And then I went on to say, if a president has mixed motives and decides that his own election is in the national interest, then those mixed motives can't constitute an impeachable offense. The most self-evident, obvious proposition. CNN leaves out the first part, leaves out the part about criminal conduct, leaves out the part where I talk about corrupt motive, and says Dershowitz said that a president who wants to get reelected can do anything, even shoot his opponent or tamper with voting machines. And that became news all over the world. It was called the Dershowitz Doctrine. The president can do anything. It was totally made up, totally, completely made up. So the question I'm facing now is, as a strong believer in the First Amendment and free speech, do I sue CNN? And and do I hold them accountable? Not easy to sue CNN. It'll cost several $1 million to do it, and there's always a chance you can lose under the First Amendment. I think I would win in the end. You know, it would be as if I got up and I made the following statement. As if I said, now let me tell you what I don't believe. I don't believe that a president can do anything to get reelected. And CNN just had the president can do anything to get reelected and left out, I don't believe, I don't believe. That's doctoring, that's changing the meaning of what I said. And so the question is, can I sue them? Can I win? Should I sue them? These are very, very difficult questions. Yeah, all right, all right. I got your view. I have your view. GoFundMe, right. That's just what I have to do. Well, I know where my support comes from. If you could all promise me that you would serve on the jury, unlike the juror in the Stone case, who had previously expressed very strong views against not only Trump but Stone. I think Stone, by the way, will probably get a new trial. I would hope that he would get a new trial because his trial was unfair. Look, one of the reasons that I'm so thrilled to be here today is I just think it's so important for there to still be bipartisan support for Israel. When I was growing up, it was interesting. All the Democrats supported Israel, but, you know, Eisenhower wasn't so good for Israel. Some of the Republicans weren't so good. John Forster Dulles. Everything is now changed. Today, the Republican Party is extraordinarily supportive of Israel, and evangelical Christians, as I mentioned, are very supportive of Israel. The Democrats are split. There are some Democrats who are supportive of Israel, I think Klobuchar and Biden, but many of the others are not. And it would be a terrible, terrible tragedy for America if America ever lost its bipartisan support for Israel. That's what happened in Britain. Now, of course, Corbyn lost overwhelmingly, as I think I think Sanders would lose overwhelmingly, but nobody knows for sure. And the idea that a vote in the United States for president becomes a kind of referendum for Israel is a very, very dangerous thing. And I think it's so important that this organization and other organizations maintain very, very strong support for Israel. I'm going to Israel next week. I'm going to be there on Election Day. As some of you may know, I've been friendly with Bibi Netanyahu since he's 22 years old. We met on a TV show called The Advocates, in which we were both advocating for Israel. His name at the time was Ben Natai. He had changed it because he wanted to go into business. This was before his brother was killed in Entebbe, and his goal was to be a business person. And then when his brother was killed, he assumed the mantle of the political member of the family, and the rest is history. So every time I go to Israel, I'm going with my daughter and her boyfriend, who's never been to Israel, and taking them to the various places. And whenever I go to Israel, I always have dinner with Sarah and Bibi. But then this time I'm going to be in Israel on Election Day. And I don't know whether it'll be a pleasant dinner or a not pleasant dinner, but I will be there. I'm not smoking any cigars with him. I'm not drinking any champagne. But I will be there to show my support. I was privileged to be in Israel with my grandson the day the embassy was moved to Jerusalem, and I was at the embassy moving. Only 2 Democrats were there, Joe Lieberman, and I was the only other one. The interesting thing, I'll tell you a statistic that you'll find shocking. More than 75% of Jewish Americans favored moving the embassy to Jerusalem when Obama was president. When Trump did it, 75% of the Jewish community opposed it. Now, there's something very wrong with that when the same exact action done by 2 different people brings about a different result. By the way, that was one of the arguments I made in front of the Senate. Such a self-evident argument, you would think. If you allow abuse of Congress or abuse of power, obstruction of Congress, these vague, meaningless, open-ended terms that have no definition to be used as criteria for impeachment, it means that the same act done by 2 separate people, it would be an impeachable offense for one, not for the other. What I did in my Senate speech is I went through 40 American presidents, 40, who have been accused of abuse of power. Washington was accused of abuse of power for not disclosing to the House and Senate the material underlying the Jay Treaty, which was very controversial. Adams was accused of abuse of power for the Alien and Sedition Act. Jefferson for that terrible decision to buy Louisiana that he didn't get the congressional approval for. Lincoln for suspending the writ of habeas corpus. Roosevelt. Every president, the other 4 or 5, probably were, but I just couldn't find the documentation for it. So the idea that you would allow abuse of power to become a criteria for impeachment would simply weaponize impeachment and turn it into a partisan tool and normalize it. It would mean that any time there's a president of one party and a House of Representatives of the other party, that president will be impeached and then acquitted. But it's not right to have impeachment. You know, I can tell you, Nancy Pelosi is dead wrong when she says the president remains forever impeached. Let me tell you why. Let's assume, do an analogy to criminal law, which impeachment is very analogous to. Let's assume somebody you know is indicted by a grand jury. 23 grand jurors, you need 12 to indict. One-sided. You only hear evidence on one side, no right to counsel. A person is indicted by a grand jury. Then there's a trial. And after 5 minutes, the jury acquits unanimously. Does that person remain indicted? No. That person has been vindicated, acquitted. And the same thing is true with impeachment. You can't have it both ways. You can't have a one-sided impeachment process without the opportunity for the president to present his evidence, to have his lawyers there to cross-examine, and then to have an acquittal to say the impeachment stands. That's ridiculous. The impeachment doesn't stand. It was a failed impeachment. The impeachment should be erased from the books. President Trump stands acquitted, stands vindicated. They didn't even get a majority, a simple majority. So, you know, the idea that he, for the rest of his life, stands convicted or impeached just is wrong, and it's become a political tool and an extremely dangerous political tool. You know, in Israel, they've asked me to just make a few comments and then really have a conversation with you, so I'm going to end. But I want to end with my definition. In Israel, they define pessimism as, oi, things are so bad, they can't possibly get any worse. And an optimist is one who says, yes, they can get worse. I'm a mixture. I'm a realist. Things are very good for the American Jewish community. We are thriving. We are doing very well. We have disproportionate impact on society through academia, through the media, through our financial success. We've earned it. We are the American dream. I spoke the other day to 2,500 Persian Jews in the Nicea temple down in Los Angeles. Remarkable gathering of people. These are people who, in 1978, could have all been killed. 1979, the revolution comes. They took the leaders. Elganian, I represented him. I represented his family. After he was killed, the family came to me. They took him out on the street, the six or seven Jewish leaders. They lined them up in front of firing squads, and they killed them all. And that could have happened to 100,000 Jews, but fortunately, most of them got out, many of them to Los Angeles, some to Great Neck, New York, some to Milan, Italy, some to London. It is an amazing community. You see this community, they are so successful. They have set up these beautiful congregations, schools, everything. It's just remarkable. It's the American dream. It's the current American dream. You're the earlier American dream. But we have contributed so much to the success of this country that we have to speak out as full first-class citizens and demand what we are entitled to. Demand support for Israel. Israel must remain strong. The only way to maintain peace and the only way to maintain the strength of the Jewish community is not through moral force alone, but through the power that we have. Power is important for the Jewish community to thrive and survive. You know, when I was introduced, your introducer said, and quoted me as saying, the Constitution, the most enduring document in humankind. I realized this Shabbos and Shul, I was wrong. I made a mistake. I withdraw. The most enduring political document in history is the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments that we read this week. That goes back close to 3,000 years, but when you look at the relationship between the 10 Commandments and this week's Parsha, Mishpatim, rules and law, you see the relationship between constitutionalism and the Bible. When I got up and made my 70-minute speech in front of the Senate, my rabbi called me and said, that was a pilpul, what you just delivered. That was a darash, that it was a basic biblical interpretation of the Constitution. And he reminded me that my name, Dershowitz, comes from the Hebrew doresh, darshan, darosh, which is biblical interpretation. And what I was trying to do was interpret 4 words of the Constitution, other crimes and misdemeanors. And I used my biblical attempt to try to make that make sense. So, you know, America, Judaism, we are in lockstep together. The Founding Fathers loved Judaism. Madison spoke Hebrew. Jefferson wrote admiringly of the Jewish people and the Jewish tradition. Washington famously wrote to the Jews of Newport, in this country we will no longer speak of toleration as if by the will of one people another people is accepted. We are all equal in America. And the Bible tells us, Hashem oz li'amo yitain. God will give the Jewish people strength, oz. Hashem yivarech et amo b'shalom. Only then will the Jewish people have peace. Strength comes before peace. Stay strong, be firm, stick to your principles, and we will prevail. Thank you. Thank you.
So if you have a question for Alan Dershowitz, there are 2 microphones in the back. Start lining up, and he'll call on you.
Okay, no restrictions on questions. I like hard questions. As long as you don't misinterpret my answer and send it to CNN. Okay. Okay, first question.
Professor Dershowitz,
Yeah.
thank you very much for your supportive and enlightening remarks. When you speak to a Democrat, liberal, left group, how are your comments different or similar to today's?
Okay, I never change my comments. I usually speak exactly the same way. By the way, I am a liberal, so I support liberalism. I am an anti-radical, and I don't think the problem on the left comes from liberals. The problem on the left comes from radicals, comes from extremists. Liberals support free speech. Liberals support due process. Liberals support Israel, just like conservatives do. Some of you are old enough to remember I used to have these debates all the time on TV with Bill Buckley. Bill Buckley was a great conservative, and he called me his favorite liberal. I called him my favorite conservative. We would always have these arguments and debates. Today, that doesn't happen. I have challenged Larry Tribe over and over again to debate me on impeachment. He won't do it. He'll be happy to insult me, attack me, say I'm not really an expert, say I'm not a constitutional lawyer, although I've been teaching it for 50 years and practicing it for more than that. But he won't debate me because debates are not part of the radical. Radicals don't debate. They shout, they name call, they scream. And when I speak to liberals, I attack the radicals. I attack the radicals very hard on the left. I pull no punches. I do say, of course, as I said here today, that I have problems with any group that doesn't support a woman's right to choose and gay rights and a range of other matters on the liberal agenda. So I make the same statement. And of course, my books are available for liberals and conservatives and radicals and reactionaries alike. So thanks for your question. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for being here today. I'm a sports journalist, so I trust nothing I see in the news.
Right.
So my question for you is,
did you understand? You're a sports journalist. I watched the All-Star game yesterday. My son works for the NBA. He's chief counsel of the Women's National Basketball Association and associate general counsel of the NBA. I did not understand that game. 157 points wins? What was going on? Explain it to me.
I have no idea. My job is to cover collegiate and national and Olympic sports.
Go ahead.
My question for you is, I see how poorly you're treated in the national news.
Right.
And my question is, behind the scenes, are you treated respectfully and differently than from the perception that we have? Like right now, you know, if you watch any of the left-wing stations, they're treating you horribly. Are you treated differently behind the scenes?
Yeah, worse.
Really? Okay.
Worse. CNN won't have me on. But, you know, it's not only CNN. How many of you in this room have heard of the 92nd Street Y?
Yeah.
The 92nd Street Y has now banned me. They will not allow me to speak. They have deplatformed me. I have spoken at the 92nd Street Y every year for the last, like, 30 or 35 years. I was the second most popular speaker after Elie Wiesel, and now they've decided I'm too controversial.
What about college campuses with the
College
students?
campuses, if I rarely get invited now, but if I get invited, they'll paint swastikas on my face, put a Hitler mustache on me, try to shout me down. You know, again, people are trying to silence my voice. I come from Brooklyn. I'm not easily silenced.
Professor, the problem you mentioned with Professor Tribe must be rampant among academics.
Right.
I'm a graduate of NYU Law School, and last week, Dean Trevor Morrison, who used to be Associate General Counsel for Obama, was out here to meet with alumni. And when I tried to engage him on in a private conversation, really with 3 or 4 other people, on the whole impeachment matter, and brought forward some of what you had said in the Senate, he remarkably, and I guess it won't surprise you, brushed me aside and said, Professor Dershowitz is a great criminal defense lawyer, but he is not a constitutional scholar.
Yeah. Well, that's the, let me just intrude there and then you finish the question. What happened is after I made my speech, the Democrats decided to get together and push that agenda. What they forgot about was that at Harvard, first-year criminal law, half of it is constitutional law. So I've been teaching constitutional criminal procedure for 50 years. Not only that, but what I taught was much more relevant to impeachment because it was the parts of the Constitution that deal with rights. I dealt with the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the ex post facto clause, the Bill of Attainder, and impeachment. On the other hand, the people who taught constitutional law were teaching about the Commerce Clause and matters that were unrelated to impeachment. So I'm a far, far more expert on impeachment from a constitutional point of view than Tribe or any of the other alleged constitutional scholars. Moreover, I'm neutral, whereas Tribe is completely biased. The Constitution always comes out his way. It's absolutely remarkable. There's never been a situation where the Constitution didn't support his ideology, his politics, and his working for Nancy Pelosi. But that was the word they spread. They forgot that I litigated over 100 constitutional cases in courts all over the country, that I've written dozens of articles and books on the Constitution, and yet they were trying to argue that I wasn't a constitutional scholar. Just put the shoe on the other foot. If Hillary Clinton had been elected president and she were impeached and I were making the same arguments, these same professors would be saying, what a great constitutional scholar. They'd be building statues to me on Martha's Vineyard instead of refusing to see me. They all failed the shoe on the other foot test. And I pass it. In 2000, I wrote a book called Supreme Injustice, where I came up with the shoe on the other foot test for the first time, and I railed against the 5 justices, conservative Republicans, who put Bush in office over Gore. I came out strongly against Bush versus Gore, and I said if the case were Gore versus Bush, I'm not sure the 5 justices and the 4 minority justices would have come out the same way. I also defended Bill Clinton for his impeachment. And even when Richard Nixon was impeached, back in the 70s, I was on the national board of the ACLU, and I defended his constitutional rights. I personally supported his impeachment, but I did not support the way he was being treated, being named as an unindicted co-conspirator, which is terribly unfair because it means you can't defend yourself. So I've passed the shoe on the other foot test right from the beginning, but because my shoe on the other foot test this time comes out in favor of Trump, suddenly I lose my status as a constitutional expert. Yeah.
The other substantive question that I really try to confront the dean with, which is, to my mind, more important, and maybe you have some thoughts on how we could deal with it, was the various anti-Semitic incidents, including support for BDS, that occurred in Greenwich Village on the NYU campus, and I was questioning him as to why the law school wasn't taking a more active role, and he was basically pushing me aside by saying, well, that's the university, that's not the law school. What can we across the country do to help confront anti-Semitism and the BDS movements on the
You already did a great deal. You already did a great deal because the president you put in office has for the first time issued an executive order saying that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism have the same status as racism and other forms of discrimination. And I worked with the president's team on that resolution and that executive order and made it certain that that executive order would in no way infringe on the First Amendment. The executive order says in terms that it shall be interpreted consistent with existing law, including the First Amendment. So it's a wonderful first step. But you're not going to get deans and presidents to do anything about it unless there's some pressure of the federal government behind them. So I'm glad the federal government now stands behind them. As President Trump said, I stood next to him when he said it. He said, look, colleges and universities, you want to be anti-Semitic? Go ahead, but don't expect the federal government to give you any funds. So By the way, that's a quid pro quo, and a perfectly lawful one. Yeah. Yeah.
Professor,
Yeah.
first I'd like to say that I am absolutely thrilled to be standing here in the same room with you and
Thank you.
talking to you.
Thank you.
But not everybody feels that way. Schiff maligned your knowledge of constitutional law.
Right.
Pelosi even suggested that maybe you should lose your
I should be disbarred. Right.
license because you.
There's a word for that. It's called McCarthyism.
There you go. There
Right.
you go. What they tried to cancel you, and we're seeing this cancellation culture, and it concerns me that we're seeing it in the Congress of the United States of America. Is there something dark happening in this country that we should be aware of?
Yes, it's very dangerous. I mean, the cancel culture is extremely dangerous. And what it does is it takes people who have accomplished an enormous amount in their lifetime. I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about James Levine of the Metropolitan Opera and other people now. Who was it that was? Oh, Stephen Reinhardt, great liberal judge of the Ninth Circuit. They're trying to cancel him. He's dead. He can't even fight back. I mean, I wrote a book about that called Guilt by Accusation. In my case, a woman I never met, never heard of, accused me of things in places I'd never been and couldn't have been. And her own lawyer admitted on tape that I couldn't have been in those places and that she's wrong, simply wrong. And she, in a series of emails, admitted she never met me. And yet, people say, oh, you've been accused, so you're canceled. It's a terrible thing that accusation becomes guilt, and it's part and parcel of CNN. It doesn't matter what the truth is. It matters what side you're on, what your identity is. If your identity politics based on race, on religion, on gender, on sexual orientation, that is all that matters, not what you did and who you are. The difference in the O.J. case and what's happening now is during the O.J. case, people hated what I did. But with the Trump matter, people hate who I am. And that's what's become even worse. And it's harder for me and my family. I have a thick skin. I've been doing this for years. But I have relatives who won't talk to me. And friends of 30 years. Friends whose kids I helped get into college. Friends whose kids I bailed out of prison, all pro bono. And they not only won't talk to me, they want trigger warnings. They want to know where I'm going to be, when I'm going to be, so they don't have to show up accident. I have a friend who had a wedding for her son, and two close friends, my wife and I, and another couple. And the other couple said, if you invite the Dershowitzes, we won't come to a wedding. And so the couple said, yes, we're inviting the Dershowitzes, and they didn't come. They didn't come to celebrate a wedding. That's how strongly they feel about somebody who stands up and defends the civil liberties of people who he doesn't necessarily agree with. And look, I don't agree with a lot of President Trump's policies. I do not agree with his immigration policies. I don't agree with his policies regarding necessarily health care taxation. That's a good reason to decide who to vote for. But it's not a good reason for taking away somebody's civil liberties or impeaching them or doing other things that's being done today in the divisive culture in which we live. That's why we have elections. And on election day, I will sit and think. I will compare the whole policy, what's best for the country, what's best for values that I believe in, and I'll cast my vote. That's the right of every American, and I'll cast it in secret, and I'll make it public if I choose to. But the idea that if you say anything that is seen as benefiting the current president, you're a traitor. I get treated worse, for example, than any of the other lawyers on the Trump defense team because the other lawyers were all Republicans, and they all favored the impeachment of President Clinton. I oppose the impeachment of President Clinton, and I'm a liberal Democrat, so I'm regarded as a traitor and somebody who's committed political treason, and that's why I've been treated so badly. But as I said, I've been doing this a long time. I have a thick skin. I'll fight back. I just hope they leave my family alone. This stays in this room. Are we off the record? I can tell you, my daughter, we got emails with pictures of members of my family from people who are threatening, and that's what happens today. If you wear a MAGA hat, you can get beaten up. Some of you saw Larry David's Curb Your Enthusiasm. That was based on me. I don't even have to wear the MAGA hat, and people won't have lunch with me. So, thank you. Well, you had lunch with me, and that's better than anything. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yes. Did our founding fathers envision a limited two-party system? And if not, why is there not a viable third party?
Well, it's so interesting. Of course, the founding fathers, Washington contemplated no parties. You know, he didn't run on a party. He was unanimously elected virtually and then probably could have served forever. But he decided 2 terms would be consistent with the American tradition. And it was really the election of 1800 that started the party system, and then it became, you know, mostly a 2-party system. We've had 4 or 5 elections where we've had multiple parties, Teddy Roosevelt, and a few others. And we've had spoilers. Obviously, President Clinton was elected, at least in part, as the result of a third-party candidate, and probably George W. Bush may have been elected as a result of Nader. And there is some evidence to suggest that President Trump's election was at least facilitated in a number of the swing states in the Middle West by the presence of third parties, but that the evidence there is a little less certain. It's interesting because most European countries, and Israel, of course, have multi-party systems and don't know which is healthier. Multi-party system, you'd have the Republicans divided into evangelical conservatives and kind of Rockefeller Republicans, or Romney, used to be able to say Romney Republicans. Today that's a little more difficult, and the Democrats would be clearly divided into Biden, Klobuchar on the one hand and Sanders, Warren on the other hand, but we have 2 parties, and the 2 parties, you struggle within the 2 parties. There's nothing in the Constitution to prevent that from spanning. And in fact, you can even the Electoral College, as you know, Maine divides its electoral votes. And you could constitutionally say that California, you get the number of electoral votes proportional to the number of people who voted for you. States don't want that because they want to increase their power. Obviously, California has enormous power with its large number of electoral votes, and it goes all or nothing. So those things can all be changed. There are now efforts to try to eliminate the Electoral College. You can't eliminate it through the Constitution because you'd never get the votes for doing that. But there's now a movement that would say that every state is pledged to have its electors vote for whoever gets a majority of the votes nationally. Whether that would be constitutional or not, I don't know. Larry Tribe would say it would be because it helps the Democrats. But whether real constitutional scholars would find it unconstitutional or not, I don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
Professor, does a constitution limit the role of the federal government to the enumerated functions in Article 1, Section 8, and by the 9th and 10th Amendments reserve all other rights to the states and the people? And if so, could this be the basic reason our country is so divided, since a living constitution has resulted in a federal government without limits that costs too much, taxes too much, and interferes with our lives too much?
That's a great political speech. And no, you stand for, I think, a very substantial number of constitutional analysts who would read the Constitution that way. I mean, as you may remember, when the Constitution was up for ratification, James Madison and others said, we don't need a Bill of Rights. Why don't we need a Bill of Rights? The federal government isn't authorized to repress free speech or establish a national religion or engage in searches and seizures. So why do we have to say that they don't have the power to do it when they already don't have the power to do it? Other framers said, let's be cautious, let's be careful, belt and suspenders. The suspenders are the text of the Constitution itself, but the belt, let's add the various bills of right to the Constitution. That view prevailed in the first 10 amendments, which were originally 12 amendments. 2 of them failed. First 10 amendments are part of our Bill of Rights. there are those who argue that that Article 1 does limit the power of the federal government, but of course it contains the words necessary and proper. And the necessary and proper clause of the Article 1 has been interpreted to mean that the federal government has many, many broader powers. Commerce Clause, for example. Take, for example, an issue that now is true in California. As you drive up here from LA, you see signs on the road, marijuana delivered, cannabis delivered. That's all against federal law. Federal law still makes it a crime to deliver cannabis or marijuana to somebody's home. But the state of California has allowed it. If the federal government wanted to move in, it could arrest every marijuana dealer because marijuana is a product that's sold across state lines. Therefore, the Commerce Clause of the Constitution gives the federal government the power to regulate it. At the moment, the federal government has deferred to the states, and so the state of California has the right to do it. When you get to sanctuary cities, that becomes a very different issue. Sanctuary cities, the state may not have the power. The cities may not have the power to refuse to enforce federal law. The whole issue of federalism is very, very complicated, and reasonable people could disagree about that, but your point of view is certainly a very plausible one. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Howard Weisenfeld, and I just have two quick statements.
Sure.
One is the fact that both my parents are from Brooklyn,
Right.
East Flatbush, so I know that's a lot of great people from that
Great.
area.
Great.
Secondly, just want to tell everybody here that next month, I'm proud to say that I've been involved with JRA since the beginning. It'll be 4 years next month
Great.
that the JRA was started, and I got to say it's fantastic. See, we started with 18 people in a room in a small restaurant. And so, and some of us here are
18 is a good number for any
That's
Jewish
true.
organization to start with. Hi.
Anyway, Professor, my question is, you've sort of answered at a certain point, but basically, considering that you are a Democrat and you say you are liberal, based on the current people that are still in the running, who, if any of them, do you see really has a chance of giving Trump, I guess, no pun intended, a run for his money? And at this point, if so, could you see yourself supporting a Democrat or that Democratic candidate?
Well, it's too early for me to know who I would support, but I'll just do an analysis for you, kind of not a personal opinion, but an analysis. My own view is that the strongest ticket still that could run against President Trump would probably be Biden-Klobuchar, because it's the Sarah Lee ticket. Remember the cake Sarah Lee? The ad was nobody doesn't like Sarah Lee. And if the Democrats nominate somebody who nobody doesn't like, even if it's a boring candidate or not particularly exciting candidate, I think that's their best chance. Because I think that if the Democrats nominate somebody with a lot of negatives, like Sanders or Warren, a lot of people simply will not vote for them. Trump has a lot of negatives too. And his numbers have gone up dramatically as a result of the impeachment, the failed impeachment. And right now he stands in a very good position. And of course, all we're talking about is 6 or 7 states, Florida plus the Midwest essentially. And those states, and Klobuchar comes from one of those states, and Biden is popular as a union leader and popular with African Americans in those states. So I think a Biden-Klobuchar ticket would probably be very strong. I think a Bloomberg-Klobuchar ticket could be somewhat strong. Well, I don't know how Bloomberg would run in the Middle West. It's hard to know. But I do think that it would be a disaster for the Democrats and a disaster for America if Sanders got the nomination. And I don't think Warren is doing well enough now to be a serious contender, but that could change. Yeah.
I recently read your book, Chutzpah, which is 30-some years old.
Right.
Loved it, and I urge everybody in the room to read that book.
Thank you.
It's fantastic.
It's called Chutzpah. Chutzpah. Somebody once walked into a bookstore in New York and said, I want the book I can't pronounce by the author I can't remember. And they said, oh, Chutzpah by Dershowitz. Yeah, that's... Yeah. Okay.
I'm the president of a synagogue about 30 miles from here.
Great.
And I've been the president for a few years. And I'm so well appreciated that my board of directors and my best friends in the temple, who are also leaders, want to change the bylaws against the term limit of the president. But despite that, and despite my wife and I talking to them, almost every single one of them literally hates Trump, literally, because they think he's unpresidential, immoral, and he lies. And they don't care if he cures cancer, they still would hate him. And that is a problem with most American Jews who don't support him and all of his Israeli, pro-Israeli stances.
No, you're absolutely right.
Now, my question is,
Yeah.
that was a statement of fact.
Right.
My question
Okay.
is,
Okay.
I don't think there's anything we can do about it, and maybe you can, but my question is, what is your opinion of the treaty with Iran? Did Obama's treaty with Iran, was that something that damaged Israel then or will in the future?
Yes, it did. I wrote a book called The Case Against the Iran Deal, and I met with President Obama in the Oval Office, and he looked me in the eye and he said, Alan, you've known me a long time. I have. I knew him when he was a student at the law school. And he said, you know, I have Israel's back. And I didn't realize that he meant Israel's back to put a target on it. Because the Iran deal was a disaster for Israel. It was a license, a red light, a green light, I'm sorry, for Iran to develop nuclear weapons. Now it would be 6 or 7 years from now. And I think that we now have not the best of all possible circumstances, but a good situation. The United States is backed out of the deal, but the Europeans are in it. So the Europeans still can maintain some control. I have no doubt that Iran is going to try to develop a nuclear arsenal. I have no doubt that no Israeli prime minister would tolerate that. If any Israeli prime minister learns that Iran is close to developing a nuclear arsenal, there will have to be military action taken to prevent that from happening. You can't trust a country that has had as one of its leaders, the moderate leader, Rafsanjani, said some years ago, that if Iran develops a nuclear weapon and drops it on Tel Aviv, that will be the end of Israel, because Israel's a one-bomb state. One bomb will destroy Israel. It'll kill 3 million Israelis. Then Israel will retaliate and kill 20 million Muslims in Tehran. And he said the trade-off would be worth it, because it would be the end of Israel, but Islam would still survive. When you have the moderate leader saying that, how do you allow a country to develop a nuclear arsenal? It just won't happen. Israel will prevent it from happening, hopefully with the support of the United States. I think getting out of the deal and leaving the Europeans in left a tolerable, acceptable situation. It would be ideal if we could sit down and make a real deal with Iran where they forever give up any aspirations for nuclear weapons and allow inspections, real inspections, not the kind we have now, that would really prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. But we're way far off from that right now. Okay, 1 or 2 more questions? And
yes.
Yeah.
Hi, I'd like to take us, if I may, away from American politics, and I'd like to ask the following question. I'm in the space of education where my organization, we prepare teens to address anti-Semitism, to be able to advocate on behalf of Israel. Quick question for you. In terms of international law, what would you point to as the seminal moment for giving Israel international legal right to exist?
Okay, let's
Because
Sure.
I'm curious if my answer aligns with yours.
Okay, well, somebody mentioned earlier on, I have a piece on the video on Israel's status, legal status under international law. But Israel wasn't established by international law. Israel was established, like the United States was established, by self-determination, by its own decision of its great Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion to declare statehood. It's a myth that Israel was created by the UN. It wasn't. Israel was given permission by the UN to have part of the land that was divided by the 1947 resolution of the UN. But Israel determined its own fate, won its statehood through military action when it was attacked, and Israel, more than almost any other country in the 20th century, has a legitimate birth certificate. Many of the other countries in the world today were established by bloodshed, by revolt, by bloodshed. Israel was established legally through the Balfour Declaration, through the declarations in the 1920s, through the UN Declaration, through articles of the Security Council. And so Israel's status is very, very solid in international law. But international law alone, I think it was Dean Acheson who once said, No country exists by reference to international law. They exist by reference to power. The reason Israel exists today is because it has a powerful military, nuclear capacity, a strong economy, very strong, increasingly strong diplomatic relations with other countries, and that's the basis. But it does have international status under international law as well. Okay, yeah, last question.
Testing, testing, got it? Okay, hi. My name is Jennifer Mariah, and this is my 16-year-old daughter, Sophia Shearman.
Hi, how are you?
And we have a couple of questions for you. The first one is, do you have an opinion on why Mitt Romney voted the way he did?
Well, he was my student in my class in criminal law, as was Ted Cruz. Now, Romney came over to me after my first speech and reminded me that I had given him an A+, and told me that he was very impressed with my talk. And then Ted Cruz came over and told me I had only given him a B+. So Romney must be smarter than Cruz. No. I had Cruz in 2 classes. The second class I gave him an A+. But the first class, he says, I gave him a B+. I wasn't aware. I'm not sure I remember that. But I think Romney didn't accept the arguments that were made. And he's very independent. Remember, he comes from Massachusetts. I knew him fairly well when he was the governor of Massachusetts. He's very good. But he has very strong negative feelings toward President Trump. And he ran on those feelings. And I think he split the difference. He voted for one article of impeachment and against the other one. I want to give him the benefit of the doubt on the basis of his own conscience. That's all I'm prepared to say. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Yes, I do, actually. I know this is a little bit of a general question, but what is your opinion of the UN? Because I've heard that there have been a lot of some anti-Semitic things going on within the UN. So, a lot. Yeah. A lot. Okay.
Okay. Let me answer that. It's a very, very good question. In 1967, I worked with Justice Arthur Goldberg, who was then the United States Permanent Representative to the UN. And I worked with him at the UN on Resolution 242, which was the peace treaty after the '67 war. And at the time, the UN was not as rampant with anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism as it became. Under the current Secretary General, it's moving in the right direction. And for the first time, Israel's ambassador to the UN has been given some status on some international organizations. So I think it's moving in the right direction, though I think in general, the UN is part of the problem, not part of the solution when it comes to Middle East peace. Yeah.
Thank you.
Last question? Okay, 2 more? Okay. Yeah. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to keep you so long. My name is Susan Stone, and I'm a recent convert to Republicanism.
Oh.
Did
you have to go through training with a rabbi, or?
Yes, and so I want to tell you that I have been politically active since elementary school about 10 years ago. And I lived in Spain during Franco's time and can tell you, as a Republican Jewish person, I feel like I did when people would talk about Franco in the streets. It's dangerous. But I would bet that about 25 to 50% of the people here are pro-choice. We love gay people and we don't care what they do. And we are the party in the middle, and the Democratic Party isn't changing. Part of the problem is the media. They're all a bunch of liars, and they should start licensing journalists, and if they present a story that's not true, they should lose their license.
Well, there is no license to be a journalist under the First
right.
Amendment, so.
Yeah, that's my problem with them. And there's so much going on in the world that we don't know about. The Epic Times I discovered recently.
Well, you're right. Walter Cronkite couldn't get a job today in the media.
Yeah.
Because he's too honest and too straight down the middle. It's a terrible thing that's going on with the media today. You talk about, many in this room, and I suspect you're absolutely right, almost all of my Republican friends, you know, at least have nuanced views. Abortion is a very complicated issue. It's a very complicated issue. I understand the arguments on all sides. Gay rights is not a complicated issue. That's a very simple issue. There's no countervailing consideration on the other side. There's no fetus involved. There's no other human being. It's just a question of privacy. But I think you have work to do. Your work is to work within the Republican Party and get them to change their platform and get them not to have a platform that makes it very, very difficult for people like me and many others like me who don't want to be on the side of radical leftists but can't vote for a party that has in its platform matters that we fundamentally disagree with. So we all have work to do.
So who in the media can we contact? Because I'm one that does write letters and make phone calls, and others here too. Is there anyone that has control in the media that we could appeal to?
If you believe, you know, there's a great joke that they tell. Two Jews were having lunch in a cafe in Vienna in the early 30s, and one of them's reading the old Yiddish newspaper, and the other one's reading the Nazi rag. And the one reading the Yiddish newspaper is saying, "What are you reading this Nazi rag?" He says, "Well, I used to read the Yiddish newspaper, and what does it say? Jews are starving, there are pogroms, Jews are discriminated against. Now I read the Nazi newspaper. The Jews control the media, the economy, the world. I'd rather read the good news than the bad news." So unfortunately, we don't control the media. We don't even have very much influence in the media. Okay, last question. Okay. One more after that. Okay, yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Question as follows. Given the recent rise of China and their ability to engage in strategic long-term planning around transportation, space, technology, etc., it seems to expose the weakness of our own democracy, which revolves around a 4-year election cycle. And as a result, the politicians, or we as a society, we have a hard time to engage in this sort of strategic planning. And China, is gaining quickly on us. Do you have an opinion about that?
Yes. Well, first of all, nobody ever said democracy is efficient. Winston Churchill once said it's the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried over time. When we have separation of powers and checks and balances, it really means inefficiency. But look, communism had opportunities. They had the 5-year plans, the 10-year plans, the 20-year plans, the 50-year plans, and they all ended up in bankruptcy and distress for the citizens. So I think, tyranny is easier because tyrants can make plans. I'll end with an interesting story about that. It's a name-dropping story. Okay. So my wife and I were having dinner with Bill and Hillary Clinton on Martha's Vineyard at the home of a friend while he was president. And Bibi just gets elected president. And our friend, the Jewish host of the dinner, starts attacking Bibi. And I start responding, and Clinton puts his hand on my knee and says, "Let me take this one." And although he didn't particularly love Bibi, he said, "Look, it's the problem with Israel," he says, is, and this is his exact words, "it's a democracy, damn it." He said, "When I want the Jordanians to do something, it's easy. I just call up the king. He does it. If I want the Egyptians, I call up the president. He does it. If I want the Saudis, I call the emir. He does it. If I call the prime minister of Israel, he says, well, let me check with my inner cabinet, my outer cabinet. I'll do a little polling. We'll have a referendum. We'll have a vote in the Knesset. I'll get back to you." He said, that's the problem. Israel's a democracy, damn it. And look at what's going on. They're about to have their 3rd election. I will be there for that election. I don't think we're going to have a definitive outcome in that election as well. And democracy is very complicated. It's so much easier to run a government if you're a tyrant, but I think those days are long gone. So 3 cheers for democracy, liberty, and bipartisanism. Thank you.
I think they like you. Thank you. So thank you all. Before we get to the book signings, which will be over there on the right, a couple of gifts. Professor Dershowitz, this was, I guess, brought to you earlier. It was dedicated to you by one of the original IDF, I think, or the first IDF pilot. And it was dedicated, the book, and handwritten to him from someone he attended law school with.
Now, we've complimented on your courage and your bravery, but what I have for you is a Jewish Republican Alliance pin. If you could actually wear that, then you would get the Bravery of the Year award.
I will be happy to put it on.
Ladies and gentlemen, he's putting it on. Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. And by the way, if you haven't gotten your tickets yet, for our 4th anniversary, we have Candace Owens in March in Woodland Hills. So looking forward to seeing you all there. Thank you.